There's an interesting part of Fate Extra CCC where we run into a bit of a brick wall on our way to the Moon Cell core, and that brick wall is the sheer influence of BB. It turns out that BB had the Podneotheron skill, which essentially gives her an authority on the same level as a Earth Mother Goddess, and the other one being the 10 Crown skill, both of them being at EX. That is to say that it put her above us on levels that we can't even conceive. So when we tried to go against her without any countermeasure for this, we got utterly obliterated. That is until Ronnie and Ren proposed a workaround, awakening your servant's spirit origin. Now that said servant is based on whatever character you're playing with at the time. I'm going to use Gil as the point of reference, but this could be either Gil, Tamamo, Nero, or Nameless. They gave them information that would allow the main character, Hakano, to enter the deepest parts of their servant's spirit. This is known as their origin, and we would do this by Ronnie and Ren sending Hakano into that servant's Spiritron core, or in regular terms, their spiritual core, their actual soul. So we get inside, understand that the origin is a place that normally shouldn't be tampered with. It gives them access to the origin power of their spirit, a power that stems so far back that even they can't reach it. The point of zero. Technically, you can even look at it as a primordial state, and this will be the only way that we could combat BB. Again, the way that Fate Extra works, everything is digitized. So even on the inside of a servant, we get inside, we see the representation of Gil's chemical structure just floating right in front of us before we progress further into his core. But since Gil is our servant, there's nobody there to protect us. And Gil can't do anything because your servant has to be immobilized for you to even start the procedure. So all he can do is watch. He can't interfere, but he can communicate. And what makes this so hilarious, there are programs that work like antibodies that are there to cleanse any foreign entities out of his spirit. So without proper protection, you, the main character, would also get wiped. And that's why before going in, Ring gives you a folder, which is a hand-sized black cube that actually had Elizabeth inside of it. Elizabeth Bathory. It essentially means that Elizabeth was allowed to invade Gil's soul without his permission. All he can do is sit back and watch. And you can just see this man is in a seething rage. He's like, hey, I'm cool with Hakano, but I didn't agree on any parties being thrown in here. So Elizabeth is the one that protects us while we're on the inside. And once we reach the core, we shift off into a portion that's almost like space. A part where Gil can no longer contact you and you lose communication with Elizabeth altogether. And that will be his origin point. As you can see, this is something that he refers to as his prototype, his zero, and what it stands for is different for each character that has this. But the point of us being here was to defeat the origin. We actually had to fight against Gil's strongest inner self, though that being would be thresholded considering that if it went all out, we'd have no chance. You can see he has like this flare coming out of his eyes and his entire body is just drowned in black and this light blue. If you're familiar with Anger Manyu's last ascension in FGO, it almost reminds me of that. We beat the origin, come out of his soul, and what this has now done is given us access to Gil's mythological mystic code. Because we pull this off, this mystic code has an unrivaled level of power to nearly anything in the verse. And it was important that we got this because it puts us on the same level as BB's 10 crowns. It actually neutralizes her 10 crowns effect. Beyond BB being in control over everything in the far side of the moon, the 10 crowns essentially twisted fate itself. It's outright stated to not be true invincibility, but it's more so of her twisting the circumstance to always work in her favor no matter what. So with her having something like this, there was no way that we could beat her. But the mystic code puts that said servant on a different level. Now I do want to point out that not everybody can achieve this code. It's not directly stated who has the criteria to have the mystic code beyond the servants that are given as main characters, but it's fairly obvious through the context that it takes a certain level level of a spirit for you to even be considered to having access. While we were inside, for example, Elizabeth said that this was the direct difference between her and Gilgamesh as a spirit. Gilgamesh was a true, proper, heroic spirit, and she referred to herself as an actual monster. And she was sad about it because she knew that she could never reach his state no matter what. She was almost envious of it. Each one of these mystic codes, for Gil, for Tamamo, for Nameless, and Nero, represent them as a character. For Tamamo, it reaches into the idea of her being a Mataratsu and pulls out some of the best of her power for that, at least as much as her container will allow. Nameless's mystic code takes into the fact of him being the incarnation of all the unnamed warriors that's mentioned in his background, the embodiment of being a hero itself. So just the very nature of his background makes him perfect for the code. Gil, as I mentioned, says that this is his prototype. Gil is one of the oldest spirits to exist in all the franchise, and I would almost liken it to bringing him to a power on the level of an unquantified Aya. Again, this is primordial territory, the origin of humanity's powers. He's tapping into a strength before everything existed. And then Nero, of course, being Mother Harlot intertwined. That would be a foundation best suited for when she achieved the power. Now you might be thinking, well, if it's taking from Nero's opportunity to become a beast, wouldn't that just make her a monster like Elizabeth? No, remember, Carmilla is an actual monster, conceptually. Nero, the idea behind being a beast, is an over concern for humanity. And funny enough, that bestial nature is something that Nero has yet to understand about even her own spirit. So when she gets her code, she perceives it as she just was able to do it through the power of love. Go figure. I mean, when most people view being a beast as a twisted version of love, that's kind of not false. All of these mystic codes look hard. I especially like Emiya's. I think him and Gil are tied for being in the front. If you remember the way that Gil was resummoned in Babylonia, he was also wearing this same outfit. When he fought against Tiamat, it was him with no plate body. The tattoos are present. That's where that form comes from. If you've seen Hollow Ataraxia, he also appeared in this form when he was going against the shadows. Now, that's not to say he was drawing from that power when he made these showcases, but it is a subtle reference back to that superior state. But he's one of the highest spirits here, so it makes sense for him to do that. Normally, this code is restricted to the extroverts, and it's such a powerful mystic code that Ronnie was telling you can only use it one time. Anything more than that will straight up self-destruct that servant spirit. It's not something that should normally be reached, and the only reason they opted to it is because they were put against the wall with Bibi. The reason why this worked against her is because that now that they have these codes, her power over them is rendered ineffective. Her Patnia Theron. Remember, I said that it gives her the authority on the level of a Earth Mother goddess. So imagine we're fighting against Tiamat back in Babylonia. Tiamat, being the original mother, would also mean that she's the mother of everybody else, which inherently gives her an authority over everybody she's fighting against. What this mystic code does is bring you back to a point of origin where the concept of mother didn't even exist yet. That person can't have an authority over you because being in this primordial state, nothing else in the world was present, and therefore the authority is negated. And these codes extend even further than that when you consider the fight that they had against Kiara. Kiara did an attack that knocked each one of these servants 1,500 light years away from her, all the way to the Horsehead Nebula. Kiara out her own mouth said that she sent them to the edge of the galaxy. And in the story, each one was able to come back to her in an instant. So beyond the negation to Bibi, the codes themselves give you access to bend reality on the same playing field. Again, it's not outright stated what powers you have access to, but just given the context, you can defy time and space itself. This part in particular is described as them reducing the time of travel to zero, going as far to say that they went faster than light. And Kiara rebuttals the same idea. And this is why for a long time, many of the community have believed that just off of this one instance alone, all of these servants gained access to being faster than light. while they're wearing this code. So considering that, I wouldn't use this a part of any ranking, at least any ordinary ranking, because it's not a normal circumstance. Plus they still had to buff the servants to reach Kiara and BB's level even with the code. But this would put every servant that I mentioned at least EX. The moon cell is much higher than Earth. It already gives you access to a plethora of mana by comparison, and we've seen this from the fact of Nameless being able to generate his Excalibur while he's here, or his image of Excalibur. So for all the people with this crazy headcanon of Emiya just being able to constantly make things on that level, this would ideally be the only form that he would be allowed to do that in, and it would have to be in this verse. Naturally, out of all these spirits, Tamamo being a Mataratsu would be the strongest if you're looking at it on a scale. Then you know there's Gil, who's 2/3 god, Nero being an untapped beast, and then Nameless reaching around their levels. It's hard to really quantify because he was a human, but he is in that same realm. And that isn't the only time that we've seen something like this. We've seen it in Extella when Nero turned into Saber Venus. We've seen something similar with Super Karna when he got the powers of Shiva and Vishnu. That was a concept that was layered on top of his original form. Different process of him getting there, but achieved nearly the same results. We've seen this with Artoria Avalon, the armament that she has, which is Marmayados. This is also a mythological mystic code, and going straight from her materials, it tells us that this originally was a weapon that the Roman god of fire, Vulcan, made for Hercules. In the case of Heracles, of course, that would be the Greek god Hephaestus. So we know that Herc has one too, considering how high he is in legend. And it tells us that just by going off of sheer power alone, this weapon is stronger than Excalibur. And when Artoria would lend Excalibur to Gawain, this was the weapon that she would use. Now mind you that Excalibur is already a top weapon to begin with, and this weapon is higher than a top weapon, just to show you how leagues apart these codes actually are. And despite of it maybe appearing to be this spear, this too is actually a sword.